Good morning. Happy Friday. I'm Greg. Welcome to the Daily Bible Wrap Up. Going through the readings. A little bit of a shift today. Well, we start in Psalm 94, where we continue there with verses 12-23. And then our New Testament reading is 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 6. And then the shift is that we go to Ecclesiastes 1 through 3. And I'll explain why I think that the reading does that when we get to that point. But for now, let's start in Psalm 94, which continues on the theme of justice. It starts out with, "Joyful are those you discipline, Lord, those you teach with your instructions." Now, on first reading here, we may think that this is about those doing injustice. But I think it's actually instructions to us to obey God and let God handle those instances of injustice. And the next line supports this. Quote, "You give them relief from troubled times until a pit is dug to capture the wicked." So you giving them relief are the people suffering injustice until justice is served with the pit to capture the wicked. No, we're always supposed to remember to let God handle it. Quote from verse 23, "God will turn the sins of evil people back on them. He will destroy them for their sins. The Lord our God will destroy them." New Testament, we are in 1 Corinthians still. Chapter 7 is where we start. Paul is now responding to questions the Corinthians asked in their last letter to Paul. So we can then conclude that 1 Corinthians is a response. So we don't know how long, if at all, that there's been this chain going on of mail back and forth. It could just very well be that this is the first letter that Paul has ever sent to them, or maybe there was a letter beforehand and then the Corinthians responded and then Paul responded and that sort of thing. We don't know, but this is what we have. Anyway, in response, Paul says, quote, "Yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations." But Paul also recognizes the carnal nature of man and says that sexual immorality is not the answer. He's clear on this. But that every man should have his own wife and vice versa. Every woman should have their own husband, which right there is implying that the relationship is a marriage, since husband and wife are marital terms. Both should fulfill the other's needs. Now, to be clear again, there are no other options given here, sex only within marriage between a man and a woman. The only time that they should consider depriving one another of sexual pleasure is to give more completely to prayer. Now, he also notes that marriage can strengthen faith. If one is a believer, for example, and the other is not, the believer brings holiness to the marriage and children. Now, and this is an important consideration, if you're this is a relationship with a believer and a non-believer. And remember, we've already talked about, you can have folks that profess to be believers, but they're not really living the life that Christ wants us to live. They have not yet become full believers. In a world where we are today with broken marriages, sometimes from the believer standpoint, where you have a believer and an unbeliever in a marriage, if the unbeliever spouse insists on leaving the believer, now this could be physical or this could be emotional, a spouse that ignores their spouse or cheats on their spouse is in essence has left the relationship of marriage, because marriage is about giving all that you can to your spouse. I kind of tripped a little bit over that all, because we give all to Christ, but we also give all of our material self in our relationships here to our spouse. That's why I kind of tripped over that a little bit. Anyway, Paul says to let them go. If they're going to leave you, let them go. Quote, for God has called you, the believer, to live in peace. Often you can't make somebody do something they don't want to do. It's probably the best way to say it. But of course, that's not the favorite option. But the favorite option, and this does happen, is that the unbeliever is saved through association with and learning from the believer. So in a lot of instances, you may feel like that you're called into that sort of a relationship and that God is using you to help your spouse, and then the spouse becomes a believer. This happens, I believe, more often than we realize. So if you're in that sort of situation, it's a rough situation. I understand that. But consider consider and meditate on this section in First Corinthians. I think would be a good exercise to do. Now, in the Old Testament, as I said, we shift to Ecclesiastes. Always have a problem pronouncing Ecclesiastes. You can't really see it here on the pad, but I have written it out phonetically so that I don't trip over it with my tongue. But you're wondering probably why are we shifting? Because we just started Second Chronicles. That's true. I think the reason why this reading plan has it in this order is because Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon. This is assumed, but I think it's a pretty well agreed upon assumption. There's nothing specific that says in there that this is Solomon, but there's so many clues that it's Solomon. I mean, as you read Ecclesiastes, you catch it. So while I haven't looked ahead, I suppose that when we're done with this book that we're going to land back in Second Chronicles where we started. And again, so we're just going to assume that Solomon's the writer. So instead of me saying Ecclesiastes refers to the author as the teacher, and instead of doing that, I'm just going to say Solomon. We'll just continue on with that. It makes it simpler. But just recognize the fact that there is the off chance that that may not be correct. It probably is correct though. So the whole focus, at least on the first part of Ecclesiastes, is that everything is meaningless. It's a depressing read. We work hard only to die. The world continues, the sun rises, the sun sets, though I should point out that from astrophysics, astronomy, and all of that, Solomon doesn't have that modern knowledge that the sun itself will eventually die as well, too. But that would probably just make him more depressed about, again, even that's meaningless. He says that, quote, history merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. And he's adding weight now to this meaningless position. He's doing an analysis. He's building a case, it sounds like. It is Solomon's wisdom he recognizes. Now, remember, Solomon asked for wisdom, and he recognizes that this wisdom has brought him to a lonely place. And I couldn't help but think when I was reading this, is like, be careful what you ask for. There is sometimes unintended consequences. It gets better, though. But for now, Solomon says, quote, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. I guess the flip side to that would be the common sense saying that ignorance is bliss. I don't know. Red pill, blue pill, that sort of thing. Ecclesiastes 2 has Solomon finding that even pleasure is meaningless. He found no meaning in building his palace and ornate gardens. He, quote, had everything a man could desire. That's in verse 8. But no meaning, despite being the greatest alive. So if this is happening to Solomon, you would think that of all this material stuff, it would happen to other folks. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second and postulate that it is exactly because he has everything that he's having problems finding meaning. He concludes that wisdom and foolishness are not different. Both wise and foolish folks will die. They end up in the same place. And this led to Solomon hating life, it seems like. He continues his analysis, turning on the futility of work. I guess what he's trying to say here is that, well, if we don't work, we'll starve, and that'll hasten death, which is the inevitable outcome anyway, so why even bother? Now, Ecclesiastes 3 starts with a list of items. He's pondering that there's a season for everything, and he presents these as opposites. Like, for example, there's a time to laugh, there's a time to cry, there's a time for war, and there's a time for peace. So he's observing the ebbs and flows of the intricacies of life and realizing that there is a time for each season. He concludes that there is nothing though better to be than to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. It's the best we can do, it sounds like he's saying. Enjoy the fruits of our labor, as these are gifts from God. So he has not lost his faith in God at this point in time. He still recognizes that there is a creator, despite all of this logical analysis that it seems like he's doing. He concludes, though, that God's purpose is for people that they should fear him. He also observes the injustices in life. Of course, we've been talking about injustice a bit recently, but that God will judge everyone, quote, in due season. So he does believe that vengeance is mine, leave the justice to God. Seems like that way. He concludes with, no one can bring us back to see what happens after we die. Now, to me, Ecclesiastes is a depressing read from someone like me, too, who tends to want to analyze deeply. I look for answers. I think that's one of the reasons why I really love diving into the Bible. I love looking for answers. I'm a science person as well, too. I think that that's another manifestation of showing the wonders of God's creation. I love all things and discovering. It's not just like what you observe, but how you think. Mathematics, for example, is a wonderfully complex science. Wonderfully, it goes way beyond 2 + 2 = 4. But it does sound depressing. But Solomon's in the middle of his analysis. We're going to pick up the second third of Ecclesiastes tomorrow. It does get better. So until then, I hope you have a wonderful day and that you walk by the Spirit today. Take care.